I have to respond to a few things that Jonathan said. One of the things I didn't mention before is something the NRA has been fighting in Pennsylvania is our Pennsylvania instant check system. They want to, every year they have someone in the House or the Senate introduce a bill to get rid of PICs and just have us use NICs. Jonathan mentioned before that the perpetrator of the horrible shooting in South Carolina had a background check. That is true. It was under the NICS system, which is not as comprehensive as PICs. And had it been under PICs, we would have been flagged. All right, so that's point number one. Point number two, whenever you hear the term law-abiding in this context, a red flag should go up. You're law-abiding, by definition, you don't steal, right? You don't jaywalk. You don't use a gun to commit a crime because you're law-abiding. This isn't about law-abiding. Anyone can be law-abiding one day and the next day commit a crime, and guess what? You're no longer law-abiding, right? So the whole idea of using this term law-abiding is really, in this context, is, I think, not really helpful in trying to understand what the issue is. Now, it's interesting we can talk about straw purchases and not cracking down on straw purchases. It's a little hard to crack down on straw purchases when you don't have the tools to do that. And you don't have the tools to do that if you don't have a universal background check system. You don't have the tools to do that if you don't have, as we try to do in Pennsylvania, a lost and stolen law that requires that gun owners notify the police when their weapon has been lost or stolen. To say, hey, you can't have these tools, law enforcement, and by the way, you're not doing a good job on cracking down on straw purchases, it doesn't follow. The other thing, I am happy to get your response, Jonathan. What would be the problem, since we have background checks in Pennsylvania right now that cover everything but long guns, what would be the problem of doing away with that exception and requiring that any time a transaction occurs regarding a long gun, whether it's private or in front of a dealer, that a background check be done?
So there's a couple problems. First of all, with regard to the sort of straw purchasing, we haven't seen the law enforcement community devote the resources it needs to prosecute the straw purchases that it knows are happening. And until they take a step towards doing what they keep insisting, they're going to do or about to do, and gosh darn it, we're going to do any minute, we don't think we should have to give one more inch to give them a larger universe of people not to prosecute. So that's the first piece of it. The second piece is universal background checks are very problematic for a couple of reasons. First of all, there's a law in Pennsylvania that prevents the creation of a registry of firearms owners. Everywhere historically we have ever seen a complete registry of gun owners, we've seen confiscation ultimately. Registration leads to confiscation. It's a precondition. We saw it in Greece, we saw it in a number of countries in the Commonwealth system that have laws that stem from the original United Kingdom. But we've also seen it in the United States. We saw it in New York City, we saw it in California, where they said, no, you have to register your guns. We want to know every gun, every time, every transaction. We just want to know who's got these. And it wasn't 10 years later, in both cases in New York and in California, where they said, okay, now we know you've got them, we want them. Or we know you've got them, we want them out of the jurisdiction. So it's very problematic when you start to allow a government to register every gun every time, particularly when, as in Pennsylvania, we have a law against creating a registry, and the state police tried to do it anyway. They're not to the gun-owning community that has a longer memory on that particular issue. The state police are not a particularly trustworthy partner, and so we're going to need a little more convincing. When you take all those facts in light of the fact that 8 out of every 10 crimes in Pennsylvania that are committed with a gun are committed with a handgun, and you couple that with the fact that 1.7% of crime guns are coming from flea markets and gun shows, we think there are bigger fish to fry. As for lost and stolen, here's the interesting issue there. There's a Supreme Court case called Hayes. Hayes was prosecuted, United States Supreme Court. Hayes was prosecuted because there was an ordinance or a law in another state, I don't remember which one, I think California, that required people to register their guns. Hayes did not register his gun because he was a felon. And it is illegal for a felon to own and possess a firearm. The state of California prosecuted him for failing to register the gun. You know what the Supreme Court said? You can't do that. You can't prosecute him. Why? Because to force him to register his gun is to force him to testify against himself in violation of the United States Constitution. You can't force somebody to do something to incriminate themselves and then prosecute them. So to the extent you've got these lost and stolen ordinances that folks are advocating for, gotta have them, gotta have them, gotta have them, who are the only people under those ordinances that can be required to report stolen and lost guns? Who are the only people? Law-abiding. You can't force a criminal to report it. You can't prosecute him for it. So when I break down gun laws into 3 buckets, right, there are 3 buckets. You've got gun laws that apply to the law-abiding, gun laws that apply to the mentally ill, and gun laws that apply to criminals. And what we've got to do is try and get these laws focused on criminals more so than on the law-abiding. And we've got a very, very difficult, vexatious, nuanced issue with regard to the mentally ill. We can talk about that if you want to.
So listen to what just happened.
I brought up the issue of background checks, and immediately he started talking about registered guns. That's not what my bill or any other background check bill requires. My bill simply closes one loophole in the law, a very narrow one, with respect to the private purchase of long guns. That's all it does. It doesn't require anyone to register a gun. It does not. So why is the defense, or why is the argument immediately against closing that narrow loophole, registry of guns, and creating this boogeyman that we are now going to have this broad registry which is going to be used to confiscate people's guns? It's nonsense. It's nonsense. And as long as the NRA continues to spew that kind of rhetoric and to try to sow fear in the minds of people who own guns, that that's what this is about, it's going to be impossible to work together to try to solve this problem. And by the way, the fact that 80% of homicides might be done with a handgun is not an argument as to why we should not require background checks for long guns as well. If you're in that 20%, I don't think you're going to care that much. And as for the lost and stolen argument, again, the lost and stolen bill in Pennsylvania does not require a registry of guns. It doesn't deal with registry at all. What it does do is something very reasonable to require that someone who owns a gun, if it's lost and stolen, let the authorities, the police, know that. Why is that important? Because that's another conduit for straw purchases. That's another conduit for a gun to go from someone who legally purchased it to someone who should not have it. And if the National Rifle Association is actually concerned about gun safety, and all those statistics about accidents, by the way, is completely immaterial, because we're not talking about accidents tonight. We're talking about volitional acts, criminal acts. If they're really concerned about gun safety, then they would not have a problem with background checks. And frankly, it was exactly this type of argument that I heard when our delegations met out in Harrisburg. And it was exactly this argument that ultimately led the spokesperson for the NRA to finally get to the point where he admitted, yeah, well, you know, honestly, we'd rather not have background checks. So understand where they're coming from, and understand the advocacy we need from ordinary citizens who want to see these common sense measures enacted, including reasonable gun owners who don't buy into this nonsense.
So we have some places where we agree.